When the worst waves of the Black Death finally began to slow, Europe fell into an uneasy silence. Streets once filled with panic now stood empty, lined with shuttered homes and abandoned shops. Entire families were gone. Entire villages had vanished from maps. Those who survived stepped into a changed world. They were fewer in number, marked by loss, and surrounded by reminders of what had been taken. Bells no longer rang for warnings, but for remembrance. Survivors walked past familiar places that now felt unrecognizable. Fields lay untended, workshops stood silent, and cities struggled to function with so many missing hands. Yet life, fragile but persistent, continued. Survivors gathered, counted who remained, and tried to rebuild routines in a world forever altered. This was not relief. It was survival after devastation. A moment where humanity paused, looked around, and realized the old world was gone, and a new one was beginning to form. When death became a daily presence, survival turned into instinct. Across Europe, people began changing the way they lived, moved, and trusted one another. Families isolated themselves inside their homes, sealing doors and windows, hoping distance might offer protection. Those who could afford it fled cities for the countryside, believing fresh air and open land could keep them safe. Others stayed behind, adapting in quieter ways, avoiding crowds, limiting contact, and learning to live with constant fear. Streets once filled with voices became pathways of caution and silence. Some households marked their doors, warning others to stay away. Food was passed without touch. Messages were spoken through shutters and walls. Care for the sick became a dangerous duty, often performed by those with no other choice. Survival was no longer about comfort or routine. It was about timing, distance, and luck. Every decision carried risk. Every day lived through felt uncertain. In a world reshaped by loss, simply staying alive became an act of endurance. While much of Europe collapsed under fear, some cities chose a different path. Instead of fleeing, they organized. Instead of panic, they enforced control. These cities did not fully understand disease, but they understood discipline. City gates were guarded day and night. Travelers were questioned, delayed, or turned away completely. Markets were reorganized, streets were cleaned, and rules were enforced with harsh penalties. Order became a weapon against chaos. Officials recorded deaths, tracked outbreaks, and separated the sick from the healthy. For the first time, governments acted not just as rulers, but as protectors of public life. These measures were imperfect, and many still died. But in cities that acted early, the spread slowed. Survival rates improved. What emerged was a powerful lesson. Organization could save lives. In the shadow of mass death, these cities laid the foundation for public health, long before the world had a name for it. Running had failed. Prayer alone had failed. And by now, people had begun to notice a terrifying truth. The plague followed movement. Every journey, every escape, every open gate helped it spread further. So cities made a decision that changed history. Instead of letting people flee, they stopped them. Gates were closed. Travelers were held outside the walls. Ships were forced to wait at sea. Days turning into weeks. Watched closely for signs of sickness. Those who showed symptoms were isolated, separated from the healthy, often far from family and comfort. It was cruel, frightening, and deeply unpopular, but it worked better than anything before it. People counted days in isolation, not knowing what would happen next. Families were divided, trade slowed, cities stood still, not from fear, but by design. For the first time, humanity stopped chasing the plague and forced it to wait. The Black Death did not end with a final battle. There was no moment of victory, no single cure, no sudden relief. Instead, the plague began to fade quietly, almost unnoticed at first. Entire cities had already been emptied. Roads were silent. Markets stood still. With fewer people traveling, fewer hands exchanging goods, and fewer crowds gathering together, the disease found fewer places to spread. Isolation slowed its movement. Closed gates reduced new outbreaks. Survivors, shaped by loss, became cautious. They avoided crowds, limited contact, and watched for signs they once ignored. In some regions, weeks passed without new deaths. In others, the plague returned briefly, then weakened again. Its grip loosened, not because humanity defeated it, but because the world it depended on had changed. The silence was heavy, filled with grief and exhaustion. The plague was retreating, but what remained was a world forever altered. When the plague finally loosened its grip, the world it left behind felt unfamiliar. Streets were quiet, homes stood empty, and entire villages seemed frozen in time. Survival had come at a cost so great that even relief felt heavy. Those who remained stepped carefully through spaces once filled with life. Families were smaller. Generations were missing. Familiar faces were gone forever. The silence was not peace. It was absence. Slowly, life began again. Fields were worked by fewer hands. Bells rang to mark days, not deaths. Markets reopened, cautious and subdued. People carried grief with them, even as they learned to live beside it. Survival was no longer about escaping the plague. It was about rebuilding meaning in a changed world. Nothing would return to how it was before. And from this emptiness, a new society was about to emerge. When the worst of the plague finally loosened its grip, Europe was left changed in ways no one expected. Entire villages were gone, fields lay empty, and the old balance of power had quietly collapsed. Those who survived now lived in a world where labor was scarce, and voices once ignored could finally be heard. For centuries, peasants had worked the land, with no choice and little reward. But after the Black Death, landowners found themselves desperate. Fields needed hands, workshops needed workers, and suddenly survival depended on the very people once controlled. Wages rose, demands were made, old rules no longer worked. Trust in authority also began to crack. The church had not stopped the plague. Nobles had fled while common people suffered. Faith in unquestioned power faded, replaced by doubt, anger, and new ways of thinking. Out of loss came change. Wealth shifted, classes blurred. The medieval world had not ended, but it was no longer the same. The plague had not only taken lives, it had reshaped society itself. After the Black Death, Europe was quieter, but nothing was the same. Lords had land, but no workers to farm it. For the first time, common people held power. Survivors demanded higher wages, better conditions, and freedom to move. Many refused to return to the lives they once lived. Feudal systems began to crack. Laws were written to force workers back into obedience, but they failed. Too many had died. Too few remained. The church also lost authority. Prayers had not stopped the plague. Faith remained, but blind trust faded. People questioned old beliefs and ancient rules. Women took new roles. Cities reshaped their economies. Social classes shifted. When the Black Death finally loosened its grip on Europe, the world it left behind was forever changed. Humanity had learned a painful truth. Disease does not follow borders, beliefs, or social status. It moves through ignorance and thrives in confusion. People began to understand that isolation could save lives, that cleanliness mattered, that crowded cities needed planning, not prayers alone. Observation slowly replaced superstition. Physicians started recording symptoms. Cities tracked outbreaks. Governments realized responsibility didn't end at walls or wealth. Most importantly, people learned that survival depended on cooperation. Communities that shared knowledge, enforced rules, and protected the vulnerable endured longer than those ruled by fear. Death did not just kill millions, it forced humanity to evolve. From this catastrophe emerged the earliest foundations of public health, medical study, and crisis response. The lessons were written in loss, but they shaped the future. The Black Death did not end with a victory. There were no celebrations, no cures, no clear moment when the world knew the danger had passed. It faded quietly, leaving behind silence, memory, and change. Entire generations were lost. Voices disappeared. Lives ended without record. Yet the world did not stop. Fields were planted again. Children were born into a world shaped by loss they would never fully understand. Those who survived carried the memory forward, not only of death, but of endurance. Humanity learned to adapt, to question, to rebuild. The plague reshaped societies, weakened old powers, and forced people to confront their fragility. The medieval world closed a chapter here. What followed was not peace, but progress shaped by experience. The Black Death passed into history, but its lessons remained, written into medicine, society, and human awareness. This was not the end of humanity's story. It was a turning point, and from that darkness, the world moved.